You look out across a vast ocean. The water is dark and overwhelmingly cold. The horizon reveals nothing but an endless expanse of shifting waves. You feel entirely trapped on this seemingly insignificant piece of land. How could anyone ever hope to cross that immense distance? For about 300,000 years, this exact feeling was the reality for your ancient ancestors. Your physical body is biologically constructed for continuous and strenuous movement. Your legs are long and incredibly efficient for walking great distances across uneven terrain. Your sweat glands allow you to run for hours under the oppressive heat of a blazing sun without overheating. But oceans and massive glaciers present an entirely different kind of physical barrier. You might naturally think that early humans simply stayed put in one familiar and safe valley. You might assume they were deeply terrified of the dark and the vast unknown. Why would you ever leave a safe and comfortable cave when the world outside is full of sharp teeth and freezing winds? The truth of your deep past is entirely different and far more spectacular. Your ancestors walked across the entire surface of this massive planet. They crossed scorching deserts that offered absolutely no drinking water for days on end. They navigated endless sheets of blinding white ice that stretched from horizon to horizon. They even sailed across terrifying oceans that you would hesitate to cross today in a modern motorized yacht. How did they manage these seemingly impossible feats without paper maps or forged metal tools? The epic journey begins in the vast and open savannas of East Africa. You are part of a small and tightly knit band of hunter-gatherers. The climate of your ancient homeland is rapidly and unpredictably shifting. The seasonal rains that bring life to the plains are completely failing year after year. The great herds of grazing animals you depend on for your very survival are moving further and further away. What do you do when the food suddenly disappears from your territory? You follow it without hesitation. You do not set out with a grand philosophical plan to conquer the world. You simply move a few miles down the rugged and dusty coastline. You move over the next high hill to see what lies in the next valley. You repeat this simple process of displacement generation after generation. Decades turn quietly into centuries while your family slowly pushes forward. Centuries turn slowly into millennia as the landscape gradually changes around you. Suddenly, your distant descendants are standing on a completely different continent facing entirely new challenges. This slow and steady crawl is exactly how the first great human migrations actually happened. But it was not always just simple walking across dry land. Sometimes the geographical obstacles required profound and desperate innovation just to stay alive. As your ancestors moved steadily out of the African continent, they eventually reached the harsh and unfamiliar environments of the Middle East and Europe. You step cautiously into a cold and incredibly dense forest. The air is entirely different here and carries the scent of pine and damp earth. The shadows beneath the thick canopy seem thicker and much more menacing. You are not the only human species walking through these ancient and foreboding woods. You encounter beings who look remarkably like you but with much heavier brows and substantially thicker bones. These are the Neanderthals. For a very long time, modern humans arrogantly thought these ancient encounters were strictly violent and competitive. You might imagine bloody battles over hunting grounds and warm caves. Geneticists Van de Pabo spent many long years meticulously extracting and sequencing the fragmented DNA from ancient Neanderthal bones found deep in European caves. His groundbreaking and Nobel Prize-winning research revealed something deeply profound about your own personal history. Your ancestors did not just fight these other beings for dominance of the landscape. They mated with them in the cold twilight of the Ice Age. They shared warm campfires and lived alongside them in the freezing valleys for thousands of years. Do you carry the ancient ghost of these intimate encounters in your own flowing blood today? You absolutely do. Most people living alive today carry a small but significant percentage of Neanderthal DNA deeply embedded in their genetic code. It is a permanent biological record of your ancestors moving into terrifying new territories and blending with the resilient populations already surviving there. You adapted to the bitter cold by physically merging with those who already knew the land. You survived the brutal winters by becoming something slightly different than what you were before. This blending was not just a single isolated incident in a dark European cave. Move your mind further east toward the vast expanses of Asia. Your ancestors eventually wandered into the remote Altai Mountains of Siberia. You seek shelter from a howling blizzard in a massive cavern known today as Denisova Cave. You find evidence of another mysterious group of humans living in this freezing environment. These are the Denisovans. Anthropologists working in this remote cave sifted through thousands of tiny bone fragments looking for clues. They found a single tiny finger bone belonging to a young girl. They extracted the ancient DNA and discovered a completely new branch of the human family tree. Your ancestors met these Denisovans in the freezing mountains and the dense jungles of Southeast Asia. You traded with them and you mated with them just as you did with the Neanderthals. Do you realize how incredibly diverse and complex your ancient family actually was? Your ancestors absorbed the genetic adaptations of the Denisovans, which helped them survive in extreme high-altitude environments. Your journey across the landmasses of the Earth was a story of constant connection and genetic exchange. But land travel was only the first chapter of your incredible global journey. Consider the truly monumental journey to the isolated continent of Australia. This massive migration requires crossing the perilous and terrifying Wallace Line. The Wallace Line is a deep-water ocean trench that permanently separates the flora and fauna of Asia from that of Australia. It is named after a prominent 19th-century naturalist who first noticed the stark difference in animal life. Even during the absolute depths of the Ice Age, when global sea levels were drastically lower, this trench remained a formidable barrier of treacherous open ocean. You absolutely cannot walk across it under any circumstances. You cannot possibly swim across it without drowning in the powerful currents. How do you get your entire family to the other side of this watery abyss? Archaeologist Chris Clarkson and his dedicated team recently excavated a remarkable site called Majbeeb in the Northern Territory of Australia. They painstakingly dug through deep layers of ancient red earth under the baking sun. They found precisely crafted stone tools and heavy grinding stones buried incredibly deep in the undisturbed soil. These ancient artifacts definitively date back an astonishing 65,000 years. This single monumental discovery completely shattered all previous accepted timelines of human migration and cognitive development. It means your ancestors successfully built sophisticated watercraft capable of crossing the open and violent ocean tens of thousands of years before the invention of agriculture or written language. They lashed together thick bundles of buoyant bamboo using tough vines. They used strong natural fibers to create primitive but highly effective sails to catch the ocean winds. They blindly trusted the invisible pull of the ocean currents to carry them into the absolute unknown. Imagine standing on the muddy shore of Southeast Asia exactly 65,000 years ago. The sky above you is a menacing dark gray. The wind is howling viciously and whipping your hair across your face. You step tentatively onto a floating raft made of bound reeds and rough-cut wood. You push off the sandy bottom and launch directly into the towering and crashing waves. You have no magnetic compass to point you toward the safety of the north. You navigate entirely by watching the fixed stars and memorizing the rhythmic patterns of the water swelling beneath your feet. Can you feel the absolute terror and the intense, thrilling rush of the open water? You survive the incredibly dangerous crossing through sheer willpower and ingenuity. You land exhausted and salt-crusted on a strange and sun-baked new shore. You encounter massive animals that look like nothing you have ever seen in your entire life. Giant and heavily armored marsupials the size of modern cars roam the dry and dusty landscape. You carefully observe their strange movements and quickly learn their daily habits. You drastically adapt your hunting strategies to survive in this bizarre and completely alien new world. Your brain is a supreme problem-solving engine that is constantly calculating the dangerous odds of survival in a hostile environment. But the dark and deep oceans were only one type of terrifying natural barrier. What happens to your endless journey when the entire world completely freezes over? Move forward in time to the brutal and unforgiving peak of the last glacial maximum. You are standing in what is now the frozen and desolate expanse of northern Siberia. The ambient temperature is so impossibly low that your warm breath instantly freezes on your face and forms ice in your eyelashes. The hard ground beneath your wrapped feet is permanently frozen solid all year round. The bitter northern wind cuts through your thick animal skin clothing like a sharp and completely invisible blade. You are facing the infamous and massive Bering Land Bridge. This was a massive and dry expanse of land temporarily connecting northern Asia directly to North America. It is scientifically known today as the lost subcontinent of Beringia. Geneticist Willersleff meticulously analyzed the fragmented DNA of ancient human remains found buried in this unforgiving and icy region. His complex genetic work revealed something entirely astonishing and counterintuitive about your resilient ancestors. Your family did not just sprint quickly across this temporary ice bridge to reach warmer climates in the south. They stayed there. They lived their entire difficult lives on this frozen and hostile tundra for thousands upon thousands of years. This long and incredible period of genetic isolation is known by scientists as the Beringian standstill. They physically and culturally adapted to the brutal and unyielding cold of the high Arctic. They hunted massive and incredibly dangerous woolly mammoths and fast-migrating herds of caribou. They ingeniously used the heavy bones and massive curved tusks of these giant animals to build their winter shelters because there were absolutely no trees to harvest for wood. Why would you purposefully choose to stay in such a miserable and freezing place? You stay there because it is your home. You stay there because you have successfully learned exactly how to extract precious warmth and vital sustenance from a seemingly barren and lifeless wasteland. You know the exact ancient migration routes of the great reindeer herds. You know precisely how to dry and cure meat so it lasts through the darkest and most desperate months of the long Arctic winter. You belong completely and utterly to the ice. But eventually the global climate begins to shift once again in a dramatic fashion. The massive continental glaciers slowly begin to melt under the strengthening sun. The global sea levels start to rise rapidly as millions of gallons of fresh water pour into the oceans. The precious land bridge you call your home is slowly and inevitably submerged beneath the freezing and dark ocean waves. You are violently forced to move your entire camp once again. You nervously follow the retreating ice down the jagged and dangerous coastline of the newly discovered Americas. You are navigating skillfully through dense and heavily tangled aquatic kelp forests. You are traveling swiftly in small and highly agile boats made of tightly stretched animal skins over wooden frames. This rapid and highly successful coastal movement is known by modern researchers as the Kelp Highway hypothesis. Anthropologist Tom Dillahay excavated an absolutely incredible ancient site called Monte Verde hidden deep in southern Chile. He dug through wet peat to find remarkably preserved ancient tent pegs made of wood. He found chewed seaweed and actual human footprints deeply preserved in a wet and muddy bog for thousands of years. This specific site is thousands of years older than the famous Clovis hunting sites found later in the dry center of the North American continent. This deeply important archaeological evidence strongly suggests that your ancestors did not slowly walk down the center of the continent as scientists once firmly believed. They paddled rapidly and continuously down the entire western coastline of the massive New World. They happily harvested rich marine life and caught fish and hunted fat seals along the entire way. They moved with incredible speed and unmatched efficiency. Within a remarkably few thousand years, they successfully reached the very southern and stormy tip of South America. Think deeply for a moment about the sheer physical magnitude of that extraordinary physical achievement. From the frozen and bone-chilling empty plains of northern Siberia to the lush and rain-soaked thick forests of Tierra del Fuego. All of this immense distance was covered entirely on foot and in small and fragile handmade skin boats. All of this was magically accomplished by ordinary people with brains identical in size and biological function to yours. Do you realize just how fiercely capable and resilient you actually are underneath your modern comforts? Now consider the final and undoubtedly most daunting frontier of all human migration. The vast and completely empty blue expanse of the open Pacific Ocean. This is the undisputed and glorious domain of the great Polynesian master navigators. They bravely and willingly embarked on purposeful deep-water voyages that fiercely challenged the very biological limits of human endurance and raw courage. They did not have magnetic compasses to reliably point them toward the true north. They did not have sophisticated brass sextants to mathematically measure their exact latitude. They read the living and breathing ocean itself as if it were a detailed written book. Anthropologist Ben Finney spent his entire long professional life deeply studying the complex and highly guarded art of traditional Polynesian navigation. He worked closely with native islanders to meticulously reconstruct massive and traditional double-hulled wooden voyaging canoes. He practically and undeniably proved that ancient master navigators could intentionally and safely sail thousands of miles across deadly open water without any modern instruments whatsoever. They strictly memorized the exact rising and setting points of hundreds of specific bright stars on the horizon. They read the subtle and underlying deep swells of the ocean currents that traveled completely uninterrupted for thousands of miles. They closely watched the daily complex flight paths of specific types of seabirds that always returned to land at dusk. They could accurately detect a tiny and completely invisible island hundreds of miles away just by deeply observing the way the ocean waves bounced off its unseen rocky shores. You are standing firmly on the wet wooden deck of a massive double-hulled canoe in the absolute middle of the deep Pacific Ocean. It is the dead and silent middle of the night. The massive ocean completely surrounding you is completely black and terrifyingly vast. You calmly and deliberately dip your bare hand into the rushing and cold water beside the boat. You carefully feel the subtle and sudden change in the water temperature that indicates a shifting underwater current. You watch the brilliant and sparkling constellations spinning slowly and silently in the massive dome of the sky above your head. You know exactly and precisely where you are in the vast and seemingly empty universe. You are entirely and completely connected to the physical rotation of the Earth and the vastness of the glowing sky. This brings a strange and incredibly quiet realization to your modern mind. It is the highly counterintuitive and surprising twist in the epic and sprawling story of human travel. Your ancient and resilient ancestors did not travel thousands of miles because they desperately wanted to be famous and celebrated explorers. They did not possess a conceptual printed map of the globe that desperately needed to be filled in with black ink. They moved out of absolute and relentless daily necessity. They moved because of sudden and disastrous climate change destroying their local habitats. They moved to find secure and abundant sources of food to feed their starving children. They moved to avoid violent and bloody conflict with neighboring bands of heavily armed humans. They moved simply because they had to survive at all costs. But the incredible invention of human agriculture fundamentally changed everything about your biology and your underlying psychology. When you painstakingly plant a massive and sprawling field of golden wheat, you cannot simply pack up your belongings and leave it behind. You must stay closely nearby and fiercely protect it from hungry animal pests and human thieves. You must build a permanent and heavy wooden fence around your precious crops. You must construct a solid and immovable heavy house made of thick mud and heavy stone. You suddenly and permanently become heavily tethered to one specific and very small piece of dirt. Agriculture was a brilliant and highly successful biological trap. It successfully provided a massive and reliable surplus of daily calories that allowed populations to explode, but it entirely and ruthlessly robbed you of your ancient and beautiful mobility. It fundamentally and permanently changed your deep spiritual and physical relationship with the entire planet. Your physical body is still fundamentally built for walking purposefully toward endless and receding distant horizons. Your complex and deeply folded brain is still perfectly wired to mentally navigate by the bright stars and the natural rolling contours of the wild landscape. But now you currently live in a highly structured and rigidly controlled world of strict borders and high concrete walls. You sit completely alone in a small and fast metal box for a full hour every single stressful morning. You travel the exact same predictable and boring paved route to a massive and gray towering concrete building. You sit mostly motionless in an expensive ergonomic chair for 8 unbroken and exhausting hours. Your lower back constantly and annoyingly aches from lack of natural movement. Your mind often feels incredibly dull and thoroughly exhausted by the glowing screen in front of you. Are you feeling the restless and constantly whispering ghost of your deeply nomadic past trying to wake you up? You eagerly and happily buy an incredibly expensive airplane ticket to fly across the wide ocean for a brief and highly scheduled vacation. You look out the small and heavily scratched plastic window at the deep blue water exactly 30,000 feet directly below you. You quickly cover in a mere handful of easy hours what took your resilient and brave ancestors thousands of incredibly difficult and dangerous years to traverse. You have completely and utterly conquered the massive distance that once separated the human family. But in doing so you have tragically and irreversibly lost the deep and visceral physical connection to the sacred journey itself. The modern technological world is so much smaller and tightly connected now. The profound and terrifying mystery of what exactly lies just beyond the next high mountain is entirely and completely gone. You look out across a vast ocean today and feel a profound and hollow emptiness. The flat and completely tamed horizon reveals absolutely nothing but empty and entirely unchallenging space. You feel entirely and hopelessly trapped in the soft and highly comfortable cage of your completely modern routine. How could anyone possibly forget that you were inherently built to cross that immense distance?